Welcome back to Andersen Acres. It's a blowy, windy, chilly day today because we have some very, very interesting weather in the fall. Some days it is burning hot and other days, like today, it's freakishly cold. Anyway, we are here today with Shadowaxs because we want to talk about his tail. We want to talk about maintaining your miniature horse's tail. Last week we talked about maintaining the mane, that gorgeous mane. Now we're going to talk about the tail. And you'll notice his tail's a little bit thin. And you'll notice there's been some chomping. So who's the culprit of the chomping? She is. The goat's been chomping at the tail. So just know that if you have sheep or goats in with your miniature horse, you may end up with a little bit of that. Okay? They do sometimes chomp at the tail. But that's okay. That is absolutely okay. We don't mind that. Shadowaxs doesn't mind that. He's not a show pony, so it's not that big a deal. But when you're caring for the tail, less is actually more. Because here's the thing about that tail. Every time you do something to it, you pull out hair. So every time you brush it, every time you wash it, you are pulling hairs. And when you're pulling hairs, you have a problem. There's a wasp. I hate wasps. But every time you pull hair, you have a problem because tails take really long to grow. You think manes take a long time to grow? Pull out all the hair on the tail and see how long that takes to grow back. It's crazy because it's very, very long hair. And it is going to take a while to grow back. So if you do muck with the tail too much, you might end up pulling out more hair than you intend, and it takes a really long time to grow back. In general, I recommend using your fingers to brush it out. Use a soft brush. Use harsher combs sparingly and only when you have to. Okay? Pretty much only when you're washing the tail. He is a white horse, so therefore we sometimes have to wash his tail because it gets a little yellowy. But we only brush his tail out when we have to, because we don't want to pull more hairs out than we have to, especially because Arwen likes to chomp on those delicate hairs at the top there. So because she does that, we don't like to mess with it more than we have to. So the gold standard kind of for miniature horse tails is that long flowy tail that drapes on the ground. Ignore his, boy horse nonsense. I know. It's not even hot today. Doesn't matter. But that long draping tail that drapes everywhere and trails behind them is what everybody wants. But actually getting that is incredibly difficult. Pretty much the only way you're going to do it is if you braid and bundle. That's what we call it, braiding and bundling. So basically how you do that is you braid this tail. Okay, so you come over here and you make sure the tail is free of knots, you make sure it's clean, and you make sure that it's nice and long and that it's going to be protected by braiding and bundling. So you braid it gently, you don't want to pull too tight. If you pull too tight, remember that this tail, yes, it's hair, but down to about there is actually a tail, a bone. That's how he swishes. So you don't want to pull too hard. You don't want to braid too tight because you definitely don't want to rip out hairs. You don't want to cause any loss of circulation. So braid gently. Don't get it too tight. And then after you braided it and secured it with an elastic, you fold it up, secure it to itself, and then you wrap it in either a sock or a wrap. Okay? That is a perfectly reasonable way to keep your pony's tail looking good, looking fresh, and growing nice and long. When you do this, though, you'll notice he swishes his tail to get the flies out of the way. So when you braid and bundle that tail, you're kind of taking that away from him. So a lot of the times people will add a braided string or twine into that so that he can still swish and get the flies off of him with his tail. You'll also want to make sure you use like fly sheets and fly spray just to make sure your miniature horse can still keep the flies off him, because he won't have that natural tail, which is what the tail is for. The tail is for swishing those flies off of him. And if you restrict that tail, you're going to have to compensate. So you'll have to use the fly sheet, use the fly spray, get a string onto that tail so that he can still maintain that fly freeness that he needs in order to be a happy, healthy pony. So you want to keep those braids nice and loose because you want to avoid hair loss and you want to avoid restricting circulation in that tail. Remember, the tail is more than just hair. The tail is actually a bone here, covered obviously in muscle and flesh and tissue, but there's actually, it's an actual tail. It's not just hair. So you do want to make sure you're not cutting off circulation, because if you're cutting off circulation, that's going to suck for him. So the downside of that braid and bundle method is it can get snagged. So if it gets snagged, because you've bundled that entire tail up, what can happen is they can end up ripping out huge chunks of their tail when they rip that sock off. So when they rip off that sock or wrap, if it gets stuck in a fence or whatever and they rip it off, they could rip out a significant chunk of their own hair, and that takes a long time to grow back. So you do want to take that into consideration, especially if you are going to show your pony, because you can't show them with no tail. So just be cautious, keep an eye on it, make sure they're not getting stuck. When you do braid and bundle, you will sometimes have to take that braid out, make sure the hair is still clean and in good condition, and then re-braid it. You'll want to do this, for example, when the very top of your braid and bundle looks kind of ragged. Did you just bite my butt? You just bit my butt. This is not fair. This is not funny. Yeah. Don't bite my butt. Anyway, so when the top of your braid and bundle starts to look all kind of raggedy, you're going to want to redo it. Just because you don't want it to actually damage the hair. Stop biting me! Stop biting me! You think it's funny. He thinks biting me is funny. He's a butthead. Yeah, you're a butthead. You are, Mr. Butthead. Anyway, not the point. But yeah, when it starts to look kind of ragged, or the wrap gets loose or has a hole in it, or maybe your wrap is completely missing. Hi, I love you too. Yes, boops. Yeah. Yeah, you're a good boy. I know you're such a good boy. I know. You're such a good boy. Anyway, so when that wrap does get a little bit loose, or when the wrap is lost entirely, a lot of times your entire sock goes missing. The sock you had on that tail, one day you go out and you go, wonder where that went. And maybe you can't even find it. Miniature horses are fancy that way. Anyway, so you do want to make sure that whenever it looks raggedy, or when that braid comes out, or when you lose the sock, you want to redo it. Take it down, make sure the tail is clean and dry before you braid. If you don't want to braid and bundle, like we obviously don't, just keep it mostly tangle-free. Like I said, don't muck with it too much. Keep it mostly tangle-free. And when it's mostly tangle-free and it looks decent and it's keeping the flies off them, that's good enough. Unless you're on your way to a show. She's fine, by the way. She's just being Arwen. But unless you're on your way to a show, the tail itself doesn't matter. If you're happy with the way it looks, it's fine. Right? It's fine. As long as it's not overly tangled, he's fine. So unless you're on the show circuit and you need to have them looking a certain way, just, give it a very gentle detangling with your fingers. Maybe use the mane and tail detangling spray just to keep it looking pretty good. It doesn't need to be fancy. As long as he can swish the flies off him, that's what his tail's for. So as long as he can swish the flies off him, you're probably doing just fine. That's about it for us here today at Andersen Acres. Look after that tail. He'll thank you for it. We'll see you tomorrow.